And if I told you that Lewis Hamilton, after months of struggle with a Ferrari that seemed indomitable, has finally found the key to tame it just before the Canada GP? Could we be facing the real beginning of your resurgence? And that was not an isolated case. Carrera after Carrera, Ferrari was forced to choose between performance or technical compliance. A withdrawal choice. While McLaren and Red Bull squeezed every gram of speed without visible commitments, Ferrari lived in a constant dilemma. Fred Vasseur, the team leader, publicly recognized the limitations of the car and the need for desperately aggressive development. He talked about visible and invisible improvements, but the watch on the track never lied. McLaren took almost 200 points in the Construction Championship. A technical and moral abyss. The hardest blow was not mechanical, it was emotional. After the Spanish Grand Prix, where once again the car was not up to it, Hamilton was caught drying his eyes under the helmet. It was not a theatrical gesture. It was the image of a pilot who had put his legacy at stake for a dream that began to crumble. Frustration was not only because of the results, but for the feeling of impotence. The British, accustomed to mold cars in his style in Mercedes, discovered that in Ferrari the tools were different, the most rigid processes and the much more structural problems. In its adaptation, Hamilton even tried to copy Leclerc's pilot style to maximize the efficiency of the SF25. He softened the curve inputs, changed the braking sequence, modified his way of modulating the accelerator. And despite everything, the car did not respond. There was no feedback, there was no progression. Each race was a lesson of humility. Each training, a fight against a car that seemed to have its own will. The context didn't help. Ferrari, historically an organization loaded with media pressure, became a hotbed of tensions. The expectations inflated by the arrival of Hamilton did not correspond to the technical reality. The SF25 was a poorly armed puzzle. The entire team was in crisis mode. Internally, there was talk of complete suspension reviews, correlation errors between wind and track tunnel, a car that worked in simulation but broke down as soon as the real asphalt touched. In that bleak scenario, Hamilton was not just a pilot. It was a symbol, hope, and in a way, victim. His glorious past contrasted with the rawness of the present. Instead of fighting for victories as he had dreamed, he was caught in a technical, emotional, and strategic nightmare. His legacy, at least in Ferrari, struck from a thread. And yet it was in that abyss where a deep change began to take shape. A silent change. One that cooked away from the spotlights, and who would find his first act of redemption in a simulator. For years, the simulator was one of Lewis Hamilton's blind points. A territory that he himself avoided, affirming with brutal honesty that he barely gave 20 laps a year on those devices. He was not interested. He preferred the real car, the track, the asphalt under his hands. But something changed. Or rather, everything changed. Because the hell of the SF25 left no option. If I wanted to survive Ferrari, I had to hug the side that had most despised virtuality. In Maranello, far from the spotlights, a dim light was lit. A light that emerged from the simulation room where Hamilton began to spend hours. Hours of analysis, test and error, direct dialogue with engineers who were also at the limit. What began as an adaptation tool became a shelter and then a redemption factory. There, without cameras, without helmets with tears, without radios full of frustration, Hamilton began to understand SF-25.it was in that digital environment where the true weaknesses of the car began to be outlined. Under controlled conditions, engineers could see in real time how certain parameters such as handling height, rear train stiffness, or aerodynamic load in medium curves interfere with Hamilton's driving style. And most importantly, they discovered that certain changes in dynamic rake, combined with a new suspension map, reduced progressive survival that frustrated the British. In parallel, Ferrari had activated a package of improvements divided into two: visible updates that focus on external aerodynamics, soil, diffuser, and others deeper, invisible to the viewer's eyes, such as the recalibration of the energy management system and fine adjustments in the electronic differential. The convergence of both strategies found its ideal place to validate the simulator. There, finally, the car ceased to be an enemy. The most surprising thing was the psychological effect. The Hamilton that came out of those night sessions was not the same that arrived in Australia. He recovered his voice at the technical meetings, leading configuration decisions again. In a leaked conversation from Maranello, there was talk of a very symbolic moment. After a simulated batch in Montreal, Hamilton took off his helmet and said, simply, "I already have it." That phrase toured the technical center as an electric spark. What seemed like a soulless platform became an extension of its instinct. The simulator, which he previously considered cold and distant, was now his ally. A mirror where, for the first time in the season, it could be reflected not as a wandering pilot, but as a real contender. Because the times he marked, the behaviors of the car that corrected, the trajectories he optimized, everything began to make sense. Everything began to align. In the registered data, improvements consisting of the curve entry were observed, in the stability under braking, and, most importantly, in the output traction. Key aspects in the Canadian layout, where aggressive pianos and violent braking require surgical precision. In each repetition, in each simulation, the SF-25 responded better. More docile. More communicative. More competitive. The team noticed it. Fred Vasseur, who had been turning off fires since the beginning of the year, changed the tone. I no longer talked about corrections. He talked about opportunities. Ferrari, who had been competing for not falling apart, now had a plan. And that plan passed through Montreal. There, everything worked in the shadow would have his first contact with the light. The question was no longer if the car would work. It was whether Hamilton would channel these new sensations, that virtual rebirth, in an asphalt performance that erased the ghosts of his start with the rampant Cavallino. The Canada Grand Prix, traditionally a chaotic and unpredictable appointment in the Formula One calendar, is emerging this year as more than a simple race for Ferrari. For Lewis Hamilton, he represents the first real opportunity to rewrite his narrative within Maranello's team. But it is not just a date indicated in the calendar. Canada, with its long straight, extreme braking areas and aggressive pianos, is a circuit that brutally exposes any mechanical weakness or aerodynamic imbalance. It is the type of track that does not forgive. But it is also the type of track where a well-tuned car, with the fair combination between stability and tip speed, can make a difference. And that is where Ferrari's hope resides. Because everything worked in the simulator, all the time invested in tiny SF-25 adjustments, aims precisely to optimize the car for this type of route. It is no accident. The team has directed its efforts towards this circuit with a surgical strategy. Front suspension settings to improve the answer in closed curves such as the fork. New motor maps designed to maximize the delivery of power in the accelerations leaving slow curves. A redistribution of aerodynamic balance that allows better stability without sacrificing speed in the lines that connect the sectors of Gilles-Villeneuve. But the most important thing is not only technical but symbolic. If Hamilton manages to execute a clean weekend, with a strong classification and a race without errors, he could completely alter the perception of his season. In an environment like the current one, where Ferrari has been defensive since the first green flag of the year, a solid performance in Canada would be more than a good score. It would be a sign for the rest of the grille that Ferrari is back, that Hamilton has not lost the touch, and that the union between them can finally start generating tangible results. From the wall, Fred Vasseur and his engineers no longer speak of limiting damage. They speak of gainable positions. They talk about realistic career rhythm. Language has changed. Internal statements, according to specialized press leaks, reveal that even Charles Leclerc has felt a substantial improvement in car behavior, which reinforces the idea that Canada can be a turning point not only for Hamilton, but for the entire team. The preparation has also been exhaustive. Ferrari has sent data directly from the simulator to Montreal weeks in advance. Specific adjustments for the thermal management of the brakes have been scheduled, a crucial element in this circuit where temperatures are triggered, especially in the famous final chicane that precedes the Wall of the Champions. And Hamilton has been studying every detail, each microsector, each possible meteorological scenario. The obsession with the minimum detail has returned. That meticulousness that defined its golden era in Mercedes is now fully active in Maranello. But the most striking thing is that this race is no longer perceived as an exam. You live as an opportunity. There is no hysterical urgency. There is conviction. Hamilton smiles again at the paddock. Interact with their engineers with body language that transmits trust. And when a pilot of his caliber feels like this, the chances change. Because your experience allows you to detect when a car is ready. And he, for the first time in the year, feels he is. If you achieve a good classification, if you keep the rhythm in the race, and if the conditions are aligned, Canada could mark the beginning of a new narrative. Not that of Hamilton who came to Ferrari looking for a last feat, but that of a champion who, after falling into the abyss, found a way to rebuild piece by piece, turn to turn, until he is competitive again. And all, starting for a weekend in Montreal that could, in silence, change the course of the entire 2025 season. The story of Lewis Hamilton with Ferrari is just beginning. But as in every good narrative, the first chapters have not been of immediate glory, but of proof and reconstruction. However, each great transformation begins with a hinge moment. An event that, in retrospect, is remembered as the true starting point. And everything indicates that this moment could be Canada. This new approach is not just tactical. It is deeply symbolic. Because success in Formula One is not always born from having the car faster. Sometimes, it is born from the will of a pilot to reprogram, to reappraise what he believed dominated, and to find in technology, as in the simulator, the key that unlocks a new era. Hamilton has shown that it can still evolve, that may still surprise, that can still lead. And if Ferrari responds to the height of the challenge, if the SF25 translates into asphalt everything he has promised in data, then this weekend will not be remembered as a good race. It will be remembered as the beginning of a new dynamic. One in which Ferrari fights seriously again. One in which Hamilton ceases to be a star in declive to become the axis of an unexpected resurgence. Now it's your turn. Do you think Hamilton will be able to channel everything learned in the simulator in a real result in Canada? Are we facing the beginning of a historic comeback or before another false alarm in Maranello?